Hello, and welcome to the Heritability of Emotional Trauma, my Evolution in the News presentation. And so I found some really interesting articles talking about trauma and behavioral issues and how those can be transferred through generations, which is technically evolution and also super duper interesting. This is we're talking about emotional trauma. So this is going to be things like the loss of a loved one, familial abuse, sexual assault, the kinds of things that are very traumatic. And so yeah, it can be transferred through heritability, not necessarily through your DNA. It's more epigenetic, but like it's changing the expression. But same thing. It's transferred through generations, so technically evolution. And so why did I choose this? Why am I talking about this? There are two main reasons. The first is I believe that talking about trauma needs to be normalized. At this point in time, it is very much like you don't talk about it. It's like a hush hush kind of subject. And I think people should be more open about it. It should be easier to talk about and easier to discuss because it's very, very widespread and very, very common. The second aspect is I'm traumatized, and learning about trauma and the science of trauma is a way that I use to cope. It's a coping mechanism. Yeah, that's another reason. Let's go away from my from my from my mental breakdown and talk about the science. So the science, what actually happened? So why did this even come about? Initially, people saw that those who were abused as children and suffered emotional abuse were much more likely to have behavioral issues and certain disabilities when they became adults. Something else that they noticed is that their children, even if their children had not suffered any abuse and were not in an environment of abuse at all, they would also have these behavioral changes. And sometimes the kids of those kids would have these behavioral changes. So they decided to test this. They decided to do a study and be like, because the popular theory at the time was that it's just the parents, since they were abused, they raised their child differently and raised them in a manner that would be conducive to this kind of behavior. So they ran an experiment. What they did is they took mice, they traumatized the mother, and in turn, the mother traumatized the offspring. Then they took the male offspring from that litter and mated it with the female. That female then had pups, and then they removed the male offspring, the traumatized male, so that they would have no input into the raising of those pups. And what we found is those pups also suffered the behavioral changes. They also have epigenetic changes. And so they did this again. They took those same pups, mated them, well, waited for them to grow, mated them with another female. They had a litter, and then those male pups were removed. And that second generation also had these changes. They had the behavioral changes and the epigenetic changes. And so they did this over and over. They did this for 6 generations. And they saw that even after the sixth generation, these behavioral changes and these epigenetic changes were consistent. Just very interesting. And so there were a lot of theories. Initially, they thought it was like methylation, DNA methylation, and maybe some other stuff that was like what was actually changing and was causing it. But the current research now is really looking into microRNA. The microRNAs are what we think changes it currently in the current landscape. And so what microRNAs are, real quick, let's go over some biology. You remember how DNA is transcribed into RNA and transcribed into proteins. Those proteins do stuff. That's our phenotype. That's what we actually see. What happens? The DNA, the RNA is taken from the DNA, gets transcribed, then goes into the cytosol, and then goes to like a ribosome, and then makes those proteins. What microRNA does is it attaches to that messenger RNA, and it dictates how quickly a protein is produced, how much of a protein is produced. they change the expression, not necessarily the DNA. The DNA itself is not changing. However, the expression of how much proteins, how quickly, how frequently, that is what's changing. And that's the epigenetic changes I was talking about earlier. And so that is what we believe that the microRNA are doing. So that leads to another question. Are we fucked then? Us who have received emotional trauma and who've received abuse, are we screwed? Are we going to pass that on to our offspring? Is this just like an endless cycle that we can't get out of? The answer is no. And I'll tell you why. Because there was another study done, multiple studies on this, on both of these aspects, multiple studies. And so what they did is they took those original traumatized pups. They took the original traumatized male pups. And they took some of them, and what they did was they put them in an environmentally enriched area. This is not the exact replica, but it was a giant 2-story enclosure. The first story had ample food and water. It had running wheels. It had enclosed areas for them to rest. On the upper floors, it had a maze that the scientists would change 3 times a week to give them mental acuity. And what they saw is giving these pups, these traumatized pups, this environmentally enriched area, they didn't pass on these behavioral changes, these epigenetic changes. And they kept running them, and then the offspring themselves, through the environmentally enriched area, through that healing and getting past that trauma, they didn't pass that on. And so, yes, trauma can be transmitted through generations. It can be transmitted genetically, but so can healing. And if we take the time and take the effort to heal, to overcome our trauma, learn about it, and improve our lives, then we can pass that healing on, and we are not just stuck. And so here are my works cited. Thank you all for listening and coming to the presentation. Have a great day.